So messing with resonance, spark gaps, end up down the road of a spark gap Tesla coil. You know, something like this is kind of familiar across the internet. You know, a lot of builds based around something that looks like that. Sort of like a, like a Don Smith deal. Looks to me like a spark gap Tesla coil, pretty much, except, instead of a tall secondary with a high impedance winding, got a much lower impedance secondary. It's going to have a much higher Q factor. Except the goal is to not spit, high voltage arcs out of one end. You're not grounding one end, spitting high voltage arcs out of the other. You're basically using it to as a conversion stage. Usually what I see is a high voltage stage, charging some capacitors, just like a spark gap Tesla coil, popping it through a spark gap, which dumps that across the primary. Got a resonant oscillation there. Basically what I'm doing is I've just got a high voltage stage, which is just super flyback driver type deal I've got, which is, I guess, a little handy because if I want to, I can play with the duty cycle and the frequency and all that. Same time, just play with the voltage on the primary there. So right now it's at like a couple volts, but that's going to be the high voltage stage. Just using that to charge the capacitor bank, pop it through spark gap, hitting the primary. So see, I've got this little slow pop right there. So I've got the scope probe over here just kind of sitting, and I can sort of kind of see where it's ringing down at. So that's the spark gap popping off. Zoom into that, you can see where it's ringing down at. So let's see, let's bump that down. So that's ringing at about a megahertz, right? The thing is, that's not the resonant frequency of this coil right here. It's closer to 5 megahertz, right? So now what I'm going to do is, and just to show at 2 volts, if I increase that, bump up the voltage a little bit, it's still going to ring at a megahertz. So this is just the ring down of that discharge, that coil. So now I'm going to carefully try to discharge that. Then I'm going to get rid of this other capacitor that I just added. So now I'm left with about 2 nanofarad or so, which is calculated to be somewhat around between 4 or 5, depends on the loading, between 4 or 5 on that 2-turn coil. So I'm going to cut that on again. Of course, already, such a small capacitance charges up real quickly, discharges real quickly, so just a couple volts there. And now you can see the ring down is much faster, rings down much faster, and we're at it's having a hard time reading it. It's real dirty. Just kind of see, get a little sparkage there. Cut the lights down. It's about 2 volts again. Cut it back on. Get the faintest little arc there. If I put that on there, I can drop the resonant frequency even more. It's ringing fairly decently now. Alright. Cut the voltage up some more. About 5-6 volts. Well, screw it. I'm just going to clip it on this table, and hopefully that's not going to kick anything nasty back into my computer. So if I actually ground that center tap, I'll probably get a higher potential out of here. So ground that. I got the gap a little bit widened out. Still the same cap, like 2 nanofarad. And I've got it about 9 volts now. Pulls about an amp. I don't know about running it like that. I don't know what that cap's gonna do. So basically here, by using one of these little puny caps, it's a 10 kV 2 nanofarad spark gap deal. It's actually a couple copper contacts that came out of a starter motor. See, you get, little flaky, just, baby arcs there. But it, again, it's cool because you've got such a high voltage from the resonance. So again, if you've actually got a legit capacitor bank going, popping off in a spark gap that's actually gonna, I guess, have some noise to it, then it kind of seems like you might be able to transfer a decent, little power. Ground one end of the coil instead of the center, then I'm gonna have higher voltage out of here. So got that grounded. Kind of see how that works, which makes sense. If I throw on the other leg, now this is going to be the high voltage. Hopefully the idea is you throw it on the center tab there, and should have it equally on each end. You can actually see how it's a little stronger on this end than on this end, because this primary is not perfectly in the middle. So what happens if I put it perfectly in the middle? So now I've just randomly added a high value extra capacitance on. It's just what I had, and with a much bigger capacitance, got these much slower discharges. See, what happens is, got that 330 kilohertz or so ringing. That is the primary oscillations with that added capacitor. Then you can see over top of it, what it's doing is, now it's the secondary is ringing over top of it at the frequency it wants to ring at, which it's dirty, the scope doesn't really pick it up. Alright, so I can see that basically tuning this to resonance would turn it into a real crappy spark gap Tesla coil. Very low turn count, but it makes up for it very slightly with the very high Q. So you still get, a little bit of arcs that come out. But given that value and particular spark gap length or distance that I'm going to run, so let's just say something like this. So popping a gap like that, I can do just say around 24 watts, right? If I want to, it's probably as wide as I'll bring the gap. Maybe I could open it up a little bit. Go higher. Maybe I can deal with something like that, right? 30, 45 watts. The next step is, since I'm going to try to deal with, let's just say, that input voltage, then again, I got to figure out what I'm going to do here. Because I started with a 2-turn coil because I was trying to make whatever capacitors I had work with the system to give me resonance on this coil. So without actually doing any other tuning on here, I just wanted it to be like a bipolar Tesla coil, spark gap, and see what I got. Alright, so now I've rewound a new primary in there, which coincidentally ends up being about quarter the length of this L2 right here. So one or two capacitors kind of on the way out there. They're not really meant for this. Put on real quick. Alright, so again, that's just a probe hanging over there. So about 160 kilohertz. Let's see. I'll cut it on. It's hard to see. Pulls about a couple amps. So I'll cut it down real low. Just a little baby spark there. A couple volts. And that might do something. But really don't have any output. Got like the tiniest little sparks there, right? That's about 20 watts right there. I really got to crank the power up so it's not efficient or anything. So something like that right there. Hard to tell. I'm already pulling 3 amps, so it's about 13.5 volts. About 3 amps, right? So I mean, it's not bad. It's not full bright or anything. It might look that way, close to it, but that's probably like quarter brightness. Again, it's not like it's efficient, right? But, again, it's just interesting because, this is just like a completely untuned type deal. I'm just dumping this cap. It's a pretty small value cap. You can hear the spark in there. It's not crazy loud or anything. Real, like, rudimentary setup. Again, sort of the spark here. Just take this tube. So it starts to burn up the filament in the actual tube here. Try to run this right here off the center tap. You see what happens when I try both legs here. So this leg, really nothing. Then I get something off this one. Dims the bulb though. So the 40 watts line to line, and then the 300 watt halogen is just only on this half of the coil. So the only way I can get that tuned in to where that will draw current, or let's just say this half is putting out, is if I have L1 tuned right there on this side with it, right? So cut this on, and I've only got like 2 volts, so very slow. Pop right there, and crank it up. I'm gonna do something like that right there, a little under 24 watts. Well, let's do like, that's about 10 watts right there, right? But 10 watts, I get a little glow in that light. And so if I take the L1 and I tune that around, see if I can get it on there. So if I tune that around, you see what happens. Now the incandescent starts coming on instead. And if I tune it back out this way, incandescent goes out. And now I'm going to start pushing more power back into this coil, which is that guy right there. If I crank it up a little bit, that's about 24 watts. Let's see, about 26, 16, let's put about 15 volts, and it's about 2.5 amps or so. Starts to put a good deal of current through there. So if I take that off, just run the incandescent, then now the voltage, you see the voltage is like too high. Starts to arc over at the same time. Just that in itself right there is almost like discharging a capacitor just really quickly. Alright. So got this other little flyback. Using that as my input, about 13.5 volts, something like that. See, it pulls about 2.5 amps. Running that bulb right now currently, which, you know, it's not bad. It's already pretty hot. Again, decent little current there. Widening the gap, you know, better capacitors. That seems like the other half of the battle. But as far as the input side, to be honest, it probably does seem maybe the most efficient route to find a fairly efficient transformer like people are using, like a neon sign transformer, and then drive that with a variac. I think some people are actually tuning the line input to their transformers to be resonant with the line frequency, which in this case is pretty much the same thing. If you look at it like that, we're just not dealing with 60 hertz. Might be a little more efficient than the other method I was using. It does seem to work to a degree. But so now if I just sort of sit my probe a little closer over here, just kind of dangle it right there, put about 14 something volts, get it popping like that. So this is the waveform that shows up from the discharge. So yeah, about 100 kilohertz. So yeah, how does the ZVS mind doing that? Not at all, seems like. That's not a bad little way to do it. Just a little flyback like that. It's not as complicated as my other circuit. But again, I don't have the same adjustability on it. It seems like it doesn't really matter, hey, because it's resonant, right? So I did try this both ways with spark gap in series with the primary and the capacitor in series with the primary. Basically swapping their roles back and forth. Didn't really notice much difference, to be honest. That's the spark across the line to line on that secondary. Basically starts burning that stuff up right there. So again, that's it's kind of interesting right there. It already starts stinking. So that's actually too close. You've already got a pretty high voltage. So it is stepping it up, right? So that gap right there is actually quite a bit further than the gap on the primary side. So here's a pretty good example of like the voltage current ratio going on here. I've got the spark gap just like a hair widened out, so there's going to be more voltage across it before it pops over. And see that high voltage arc that was going on before, line to line. I put the 40-watt bulbs I have in there, and it's really at no point that I could drive them without that arcing over. With this 100-watt bulb in here, it tends to do that a whole lot less, so I can actually drive some power in there. So got the same ZVS setup. I'm gonna be about 8 volts starting off. So it's about 8 watts, popping it like that. That's the bulb. Starts going a little bit. So whereas something like the 300-watt halogen, it's just, you're going to need a lot more juice to get that going. And something like the 40-watter was just arcing over. But something like this is a pretty decent load for it. It's going. I'll crank that up. Actually get that going pretty bright. Now that spark gap doesn't want to maintain where it's at, so it kind of jumps around a little bit. You see about the point where I get it pretty damn bright. Say, doesn't really want to maintain that. About 18 volts. Efficiency wise, starts looking a little bit better popping off the higher voltage like that. Just finding the right type of load. But again, this is a fairly vicious output. When you actually look at the discharge, it looks like what it would look like if you had maybe 5,000 volts or more, maybe even 10,000 volts discharging across a little capacitor like this or something like that. So it's pretty vicious.